Power, glory, and tragedy intertwine in one of the most heart-wrenching family stories in the Bible. At the height of his reign, David, Israel's greatest king, witnessed the collapse of his own dynasty. Incest, murder, betrayal, and civil war tore apart the royal family. A grim prophecy was fulfilled, showing how a single sin unleashed a storm of destruction that spanned generations. Today, we will explore the details of this royal drama, an event that forever changed the fate of Israel and offers timeless lessons on family, power, and redemption. At the peak of his kingdom, when neighboring nations bowed to his authority, David seemed to have achieved everything a man could desire. His dominion stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates River, his storehouses overflowed with wealth, and his name inspired fear and respect among all nations. However, it was one spring in Jerusalem, during a time when kings went to war, that David broke with tradition and chose to remain in his palace. That afternoon, as he walked along the terrace, his eyes fell upon a vision that would change his life and the life of his family forever. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, was bathing at her home. Her beauty stirred in the king a forbidden desire that he could not or would not control. What followed was a downward spiral of disastrous decisions. David, known as a man after God's own heart, sent messengers to summon Bathsheba. The scriptures, with a painful simplicity, tell us that he lay with her. 2 Samuel 11:4. That encounter lasted only a night, but the consequences of that sin resonated for generations. When Bathsheba informed him that she was pregnant, panic must have gripped David's heart. Instead of confessing his sin and facing the consequences, he attempted to cover it up. David summoned Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would spend the night with his wife, thereby covering up his sin and having Uriah claim paternity of the child. But Uriah, in his integrity, refused to enjoy the comforts of his home while his comrades were still fighting on the battlefield. Failing in his attempt to conceal the truth, David made an even darker decision. He ordered his commander Joab to place Uriah in the most dangerous part of the battle, leaving him exposed to death. The plan succeeded. Uriah, the loyal warrior, died, and David quickly took Bathsheba as his wife. Perhaps he thought his sin had been buried with Uriah on the battlefield, but God saw everything. The prophet Nathan was sent by God to confront David, and through a parable about a rich man who stole the only lamb from a poor man, Nathan touched David's heart. David's anger toward the rich man in the parable revealed his own blindness to his sin. When Nathan told him, "You are that man," 2 Samuel 12:7, David's world came crashing down. The prophecy that followed would be the harbinger of a family tragedy that would unfold in the years to come. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised Uriah the Hittite and took his wife to be your own. 2 Samuel 12:10. The first blow of this prophecy came with the death of the child born from this forbidden relationship. Deeply remorseful, David cried out in Psalm 51 verse 10, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." In his mercy, God forgave David, but the consequences of his actions continued to devastate his family. The birth of Solomon, David's second son with Bathsheba, brought a glimmer of hope for redemption. God loved the child, and through Nathan gave him the name Jedediah, meaning beloved of the Lord. However, this blessing did not prevent the fulfillment of the prophecy that the sword would never depart from David's house, as tragedy continued to unfold through his other children. The deterioration of the royal family began subtly. David's sin had undermined the moral foundation of his house. How could he discipline his children with authority when his own moral example had been deeply compromised? The lack of firm and consistent discipline began to show in the behavior of his children. What should have been a palace of justice and righteousness became fertile ground for intrigue, jealousy, and excessive ambition. The princes, raised in the shadow of power and wealth, developed a distorted view of privilege and impunity. David's paternal love, although genuine, was often expressed in a permissive manner, which proved fatal for the future of his children. The seeds of tragedy had already been sown, and with them, a dark future that would mark the fate of an entire dynasty. In the years to come, the bitter, relentless fruits of those seeds would begin to emerge, triggering a series of events that would embody all the elements of an epic tragedy: forbidden love, revenge, betrayal, war, and death. It would all begin with the heart-wrenching story of Tamar, a princess whose beauty would ignite an uncontrollable passion in the heart of her brother, Amnon. The decisions we make not only affect us, but can have much deeper repercussions, extending through generations. Sin, when not addressed with seriousness and repentance, has the power to contaminate not only those who commit it, but also those who follow them, perpetuating their pain over time. The failings of parents often manifest even more forcefully in the lives of their children, like a shadow that spreads without being stopped. This is a lesson that Amnon and the royal family of Israel would learn in the most painful way. In the magnificent palace of David, once a symbol of Israel's power and glory, shadows were beginning to lengthen, heralding a storm that would test the limits of love, divine justice, and forgiveness. It was in this context of luxury and apparent security that Tamar, the king's daughter, would live her own tragedy. Her personal story, a series of heartbreaking events, would mark the beginning of a chain of misfortunes that would eventually bring down the royal family. Tamar, daughter of David and sister of Absalom, was known throughout Israel for her stunning beauty. However, beyond her appearance, she possessed a nobility of spirit that set her apart. As a princess, she had been raised with the duty to honor the traditions of her people and maintain her purity until marriage, values that had been instilled in her with rigor. However, what should have been a blessing, her beauty, would become the source of her suffering. Amnon, the eldest son of David, became consumed by an unhealthy obsession with his half-sister, Tamar. The scriptures describe how his desire for her grew so intense that it made him physically ill, overwhelmed by a passion that he could not control. Tamar, a virgin and innocent young woman, became the object of this forbidden lust that took hold of him. The narrative reveals how Amnon's heart filled with uncontrollable lust, leading him to commit an unimaginable act of transgression. Jonadab, Amnon's cunning cousin, observed his relative's distress. Instead of advising him to distance himself from his impure thoughts, Jonadab concocted a malicious scheme. This plan would forever alter the fate of the royal family. According to Jonadab's strategy, Amnon would pretend to be sick and request that Tamar be sent to him to prepare food for him. Tamar, trusting in her father's authority as king and believing the situation to be innocent, did not suspect that she was falling into a trap that would forever change her life. When Tamar arrived at Amnon's room, carrying the food she had prepared, she found him seemingly ill in bed. Amnon then asked everyone to leave, isolating himself with Tamar. The Bible painfully details what followed. Amnon cast aside the facade of a caring brother and revealed his true intentions, committing an act of emotional violence in his attempt to force Tamar into bed with him. Tamar's response was both wise and desperate. "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this wicked thing." She, aware of the grave consequences of such an act, tried to reason with him. She suggested that he speak to the king, believing that their father, David, could find a fair resolution to the situation. But Amnon, blinded by his lust, refused to listen and, using his physical strength, carried out the violent act that would destroy not only his soul, but also his sister's. What followed was the harrowing realization of how destructive unaddressed sin can be. Immediately after the assault, Amnon's feelings of passion turned into hatred, even more intense than his earlier desire for Tamar. His lust transformed into contempt, and without mercy, he ordered her out of his room, instructing his servants to throw her out and lock the door behind her. Tamar, in utter despair, tore her long-sleeved tunic, the symbol of the virgin daughters of the king, and covered her head with ashes, a traditional sign of extreme mourning. Her sorrow was palpable, and her cries of despair echoed through the palace as she walked, broken-hearted, to the house of her brother Absalom. Absalom's reaction to Tamar's tragic fate was eerily calm, though beneath the surface a rage began to grow. He told her to be silent, suggesting that Amnon was her brother and that she should not worry about what had happened. However, deep in his heart, Absalom began to devise a plan for vengeance, a cold determination that would escalate the family tragedy even further. The most disturbing aspect of this story is David's inaction. When the king learned of what had transpired, his anger was evident, but he took no action against his firstborn son. David's silence was devastating. Perhaps his own sin with Bathsheba had eroded his ability to act with the moral authority necessary to punish Amnon. This inaction would have far-reaching consequences. Tamar, the violated princess, withdrew to Absalom's house, where she lived as a broken woman. Her story serves not only as a painful reminder of the suffering endured by victims of abuse, but also as a warning about the complicity of silence and the omission of justice. In the years that followed, Absalom's quest for revenge would mark the beginning of an endless cycle of violence and destruction within the royal family. David's sin with Bathsheba had planted the seeds of tragedy, and now its bitter and painful fruits were beginning to manifest. The sword, which God had promised would never depart from David's house, had found its first target, and Amnon's fate as the firstborn son was sealed in blood. The story of Amnon, the heir apparent, became a grim reminder of how power and privilege, when exercised without wisdom and reverence for God, can lead to ruin. After the assault, Amnon continued to live in the palace as though nothing had happened, with no action taken by his father. David's family story grew darker by the day, and the unresolved decisions, unpunished sins, would ultimately cause Israel's throne to tremble in a sea of tragedy. Seeing the apparent lack of consequences for his eldest son's actions, David likely came to believe that Amnon was shielded by his position as the heir to the throne. This belief only reinforced the sense of impunity that David himself had cultivated. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, until Amnon, blinded by his power, began to think his actions would go unpunished. However, he had underestimated the calculated patience of his brother Absalom, who, for 2 long years, harbored his resentment like a bitter treasure, waiting for the perfect moment for revenge. During this time, Absalom remained completely silent toward Amnon, offering neither reproach nor forgiveness. His silence was not a sign of reconciliation, but of premeditation. In his heart, Absalom was carefully crafting his plan, echoing the wise proverb, "He who conceals hatred has lying lips." Proverbs 10:18. Absalom had mastered the art of subtlety, and his waiting time was not wasted. When the sheep shearing season arrived, a time traditionally marked by great feasts in Israel, Absalom saw the perfect opportunity to put his plan into motion. With the cunning inherited from his father, Absalom organized a grand banquet and invited all of King David's sons, including Amnon. The plan was so well executed that even David became involved, though indirectly. Absalom insisted that Amnon attend, ironically replicating the very scenario that Amnon had used to lure his sister Tamar to her destruction. Just as Tamar had been deceived by her obedience to her father, Amnon would fall, this time due to his own arrogance and contempt. The banquet began like any other celebration, with wine flowing freely, and as the hours passed, Amnon's heart grew lighter with the joy brought by alcohol. It was then that Absalom signaled to his servants, When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and I tell you, strike Amnon, then kill him. 2 Samuel 13:28. The brutality of the murder was as violent as the crime Amnon had committed against Tamar. Absalom's servants attacked Amnon in the midst of the celebration, mortally wounding him before the other sons of the king. Terrified, they fled, fearing for their own lives. News of the murder reached David in a distorted form, as is often the case in times of crisis. Initially, it was believed that all of the king's sons had been killed. David, overwhelmed with despair, tore his clothes and fell to the ground, surrounded by his servants who shared in his grief. In the midst of his anguish, it was Jonadab, Amnon's clever cousin, who clarified the situation with a disturbing revelation. Only Amnon had died, and his death had been the result of a plan Absalom had devised from the day Amnon raped Tamar, 2 Samuel 13:32. Amnon's death not only marked the end of his life, but also sealed the fate of David's royal family. The firstborn, the natural heir to the throne of Israel, was dead, not at the hands of an enemy, but by the vengeful hand of his own brother. The prophecy that the sword would never depart from David's house, 2 Samuel 12:10, was fulfilled in a more bitter and tragic manner than anyone could have imagined. Amnon's murder did not bring justice to Tamar, nor peace to Absalom's tormented heart. On the contrary, it opened the door to even more heart-wrenching events that not only threatened the unity of the royal family, but also the stability of the kingdom itself. After committing fratricide, Absalom fled into exile in Geshur, where he would remain for 3 long years, leaving behind a grieving father and a kingdom already showing signs of fracture. During these 3 years, David was torn between his paternal love and his royal duty. Though his heart was marked by tragedy, it longed for the return of his prodigal son. Despite his sorrow, reconciliation between David and Absalom did not come immediately. It was Joab, David's shrewd general, who devised a plan to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. He used a wise woman from Tekoa to tell the king a parable that ultimately convinced David to allow Absalom's return, though not without reservations. Absalom returned, but for another 2 years he lived in Jerusalem without seeing his father, which only fueled the bitterness he felt toward him. Finally, Absalom decided to take action. With cunning, he began to steal the hearts of the men of Israel, presenting himself as a just leader who cared for the people. Each morning, he positioned himself at the city gate, and when the Israelites came with cases to present to the king, he would tell them, "Your case is good and right, but there is no one to listen to you from the king." 2 Samuel 15:3. With these words, he wove a network of loyalties that would eventually allow him to openly rebel against his father. When Absalom declared himself king in Hebron, the news reached David like a lightning strike. "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom," 2 Samuel 15:13, they informed him. King David, who had faced giants in his youth, was now fleeing barefoot in mourning toward the Mount of Olives, leaving behind Jerusalem and a divided kingdom. In his flight, he took with him a few loyal followers and 600 warriors who accompanied him into exile. The ensuing civil war divided Israel and tested David's love for his rebellious son. Despite the betrayal, David commanded his generals to treat Absalom gently, "For my sake, for the young man Absalom." 2 Samuel 16:5. The decisive battle took place in the forest of Ephraim, where Absalom's army, despite being numerically superior, was defeated by David's forces. Amid the chaos of the battle, Absalom, riding his mule, had his long hair caught in the branches of an oak tree, leaving him suspended between heaven and earth. Joab, disobeying David's orders to show compassion for his son, thrust 3 javelins into Absalom's heart. His death was as dramatic as his life. Hanging between the heavens and the earth, it symbolized his eternal division as both son and usurper. David's grief over his son's death echoed deeply in the hearts of all who heard it. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place." 2 Samuel 18:30. Absalom's tragic downfall represents one of the most poignant moments in biblical history, a reminder of the immense pain that can result from human decisions and the consequences of a life marked by conflict and unchecked ambition. The prophecy that the sword would never depart from the house of David, 2 Samuel 12:10, was being fulfilled, but now in an increasingly painful manner. The death of Absalom, though it seemed to clear the path to the throne, did not bring an end to the internal struggles for power. In David's house, disputes were far from over, and a new son of David, Adonijah, began to form his own plans to secure the throne. Adonijah, David's fourth son, emerged as a legitimate contender to the throne after Absalom's death. He was described in the scripture as a man of great beauty, born shortly after Absalom. And like his fallen brother, his physical appearance was matched by a boundless ambition. His desire for power rivaled his physical appeal, a characteristic that defined his personality. However, the Bible reveals a critical aspect of his upbringing. His father, David, never corrected or questioned his actions, a lack of paternal authority that shaped him in a dangerous way. King David, marked by the pain of losing his other children, seemed incapable of confronting Adonijah, which allowed his ambitions to grow unchecked. As David grew older and his health deteriorated, Adonijah saw his weakness as an opportunity. The text tells us that he exalted himself, proclaiming, "I will be king." Following in the footsteps of his brother Absalom, Adonijah surrounded himself with symbols of power. He prepared chariots, riders, and 50 men to run before him as an emblem of his attempt to usurp the throne. Additionally, he began to forge alliances with key figures in the kingdom, including Joab, the military commander, and Abiathar, the priest, men who, while having loyally served David, were also susceptible to the temptation of power. However, despite the support of these prominent figures, not everyone in the kingdom sided with Adonijah. Some remained firmly loyal to David, such as the priest Zadok, the prophet Nathan, and the brave warriors who had served the king through years of conflict and tribulation. These men knew something that Adonijah did not seem to understand. David had promised Bathsheba that Solomon, their son, would be the next king. David's promise was clear and irrevocable, despite Adonijah's disregard for it. The conflict reached its peak when Adonijah organized a great banquet near the stone of Zoheleth, inviting all his brothers and the men of Judah, but excluding Solomon, Bathsheba, and those loyal to David. This act of exclusion was a clear sign of his intentions to seize the kingdom. It was then that Nathan, the prophet, went to Bathsheba to warn her about Adonijah's plans. With political wisdom, Nathan advised Bathsheba to approach King David and remind him of his promise concerning Solomon. What followed was a dramatic scene at the royal palace, one of those moments that marked a turning point in the history of Israel. Bathsheba approached King David, and as she spoke, Nathan entered and confirmed the truth of the situation. Together, they confronted the aging king about the future of the kingdom. Awakening from his stupor, David grasped the gravity of the situation and immediately took action to secure Solomon's future. He commanded that Solomon be anointed king at Gihon, with all the people proclaiming him as the legitimate successor of David. Word of the coronation spread quickly, and when Adonijah and his followers heard of it, panic swept through their ranks. Fearing for his life, Adonijah fled to the altar, seeking sanctuary. He clung to the horns of the altar, symbolizing his plea for mercy. Solomon, wise and prudent, offered him a chance for redemption. If Adonijah proved to be a man of integrity, no harm would come to him. But if malice was found in his heart, his life would be in jeopardy. Adonijah accepted this offer, but his ambition was far from extinguished. Later, he attempted to further secure his position by requesting the hand of Abishag, the young Shunammite woman who had cared for David in his final days. This request was a calculated move to solidify his claim to the throne, as taking the king's concubines was a royal prerogative. Solomon immediately understood the implications of this request. Not only was it an attempt to assert his legitimacy as heir, but it also posed a direct threat to Solomon's reign. Solomon made a decisive move. Adonijah had to die. He ordered his execution, sealing the fate of one who could never control his thirst for power. The death of Adonijah ended the contest for the throne and firmly established Solomon as the legitimate king. The prophecy about the sword never departing from the house of David remained in effect. But with Solomon on the throne, it seemed a new era was dawning for Israel. Despite the efforts of Solomon's older brothers, who had tried to seize the throne by force, he demonstrated that wisdom and humility were the true foundations of rulership. His reign, marked by peace and prosperity, became a golden age for Israel. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem, the project David had dreamed of but could not complete, became a symbol of his success. Furthermore, Solomon's wisdom spread beyond Israel's borders, with the Queen of Sheba visiting his court to acknowledge the greatness of his rule. With God's blessing, Solomon ruled with justice and wisdom, and his reign appeared to fulfill the promise of restoration for the house of David. However, the echoes of past prophecies and family conflicts lingered, reminding that even though the throne was secured, the shadows of the past were never fully erased. In the story of David's sons, the tragic cycle of wrong decisions and their consequences offers a timeless and profound lesson. Even though Solomon, the wisest of kings, seemed immune to common temptations, his wisdom did not shield him from eventual downfall. Solomon's story shows how power and wealth can corrupt even the most prudent, and how seemingly minor decisions can lead to devastating consequences. Solomon began his reign with extraordinary wisdom, building a prosperous empire and establishing a temple dedicated to God. However, his rise to power was gradual, and in his later years, the pursuit of personal fulfillment led him down a perilous path. Instead of remaining true to his calling, Solomon allowed his foreign wives, whom he had married for political alliances, to influence his heart, turning him away from the one true God. The Bible clearly describes this shift. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. 1 Kings 11:4. This gradual departure from the right path angered God, and the prophecy of the sword spoken by the prophet Nathan came to pass. The house of David, which had been blessed for generations, would now be divided, though the prophecy would not be fulfilled during Solomon's lifetime, but through his son Rehoboam. The united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had expanded was destined to split. Despite enjoying prosperity and peace throughout his reign, Solomon's personal choices and disregard for God's warnings led him to lose the divine blessing he had once received. The consequences of his sin were inevitable. The kingdom would divide under the reign of his son Rehoboam. Instead of a unified and prosperous reign, the tribes of Israel fractured, fulfilling God's word. In his later years, Solomon seemed to come to a realization about the futility of seeking fulfillment in material things and human relationships. The book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to him, reflects a deep reflection on his life, filled with regret and melancholy. In this book, Solomon expresses how wealth, power, and worldly pleasures failed to bring the peace or satisfaction he had expected. Instead, he concluded that all was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 1:14. This final revelation shows us that even the wisest man in the world was not immune to the dangers of selfishness, temptation, and a corrupted heart. The story of Solomon fits into a tragic pattern that marks the lives of David's sons. Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, and Solomon all faced their own demons and made choices that led them to ruin. Amnon, driven by lust. Absalom, by a desire for revenge and political ambition. Adonijah, by arrogance and pride. And Solomon, by a slow drift from a righteous heart. Each of them, despite being endowed with great gifts and opportunities, ultimately suffered the consequences of their wrong decisions. Nathan's prophecy about the sword never departing from the house of David was fulfilled across several generations, illustrating how one person's sin can have devastating repercussions for an entire family and nation. In the story of David and his sons, we not only witness the failures of humanity, but also a call to reflect on the choices we make, the motivations that drive us, and the consequences that follow. In the story of David and his sons, we see a recurring theme regarding the use of power and justice. The decisions made by Amnon, Absalom, Adonijah, and Solomon's use of his wisdom to justify his own weaknesses teach us that power comes with responsibility. No position, no matter how high, exempts us from the moral duty to be accountable for our actions. David's silence in the face of the injustice committed by Amnon against his sister Tamar and his inability to correct his children remind us of the dangers of omission. The king's silence did not bring peace. Instead, it fueled a cycle of violence that echoed through generations. This lesson about omission and justice and how inaction can lead to fatal consequences is one of the most powerful teachings in the biblical narrative. One of the most human lessons from the story of David's sons is the complexity of fatherly love. While David was a formidable king and leader, his love for his children was never without pain. His lament for the death of Absalom, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom," 2 Samuel 18:33, reflects a profound sorrow that only a father can truly understand. Despite the betrayals and rebellions of his children, David's love remained a painful reminder of the need to protect and guide our loved ones, even when our decisions bring about painful consequences. The stories of David's sons, though tragic, provide a profound lesson on human choices and the nature of power. None of David's sons, no matter how wise, handsome, or charismatic, were immune to the repercussions of their decisions. These narratives teach us that sin, even when seemingly small or gradual, can lead to devastating effects. They remind us that through our choices, we shape not only our own destinies, but also the fates of those around us. Finally, the stories of David's sons offer both a warning and a glimmer of hope. The warning is clear. Power without responsibility, desire unchecked, and ambition without limits can destroy even the greatest among us. Yet, hope is also evident, as through all the tragedies, we see God's grace at work, redeeming even the darkest situations. The stories of David's sons continue to teach us today because, in essence, they are our own stories. They are narratives about choices and consequences, power and responsibility, love and betrayal. Themes that remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.